to give you a bit of an overview about what I'm going to be talking about today, we're going to begin just very briefly, why should we care about this connection between autism and GI symptoms? I suspect that if you're in the audience, this is not new information, but so we'll do that very quickly. Talk about some pathways linking GI symptoms or gut dysregulation with autism. So why do we see this connection? A little bit of an overview on sort of where the field stand in terms of gut microbiome research. And then the second portion, I really want to be sort of as useful to you as possible. So we're going to get into hopefully how to identify and manage these symptoms. And I'm also going to present some resources and answer some questions. So to begin, why should we care about this connection between autism and the gut? The first thing is that we know that GI symptoms are actually quite common in this population. So although estimates across studies vary a lot, it seems that around half of adults or children with autism may have chronic GI symptoms over the course of their life. Now, the most common are things like constipation, diarrhea, and abdominal pain. Though we see other things like reflux and more specific GI disorders as well. In addition to these GI symptoms, it's common for people to have co-occurring food sensitivities or preferences, difficulties around meal times, difficulties with toileting. So it's not uncommon for these GI symptoms to be accompanied by other things. And the latest research shows that there's not really an autism-specific gut pathology. And what I mean by that is that it's not like there's a specific thing that is, quote, wrong with the gut or the GI system in autism that is specific to autism. Rather, it seems like these individuals are more likely to have all of the same GI conditions as the general population, but are just more likely to have them. As I said, GI symptoms can co-occur with a lot of other conditions. There are links between, for example, constipation and behavioral symptoms, stress, anxiety, even the stress response. We know that things like seizures and sleep disorders can be exacerbated when someone has GI dysfunction. So for these reasons, it's important. We know that they're common. We know that they co-occur with a lot of things. I also just briefly want to touch on a study that I have been doing, looking at the experiences that children with autism and co-occurring GI symptoms have, as well as their experience of the families. And so what we did here is we recruited parents that have a child with autism and GI symptoms, and we conducted interviews, some in person, some over the phone or video. And we did what's called an inductive analysis, in which we really used the data, we let the data speak for itself and see what sort of themes came up that, that parents and individuals were telling us in terms of their experiences. So the first thing, and this is just a preview because I'll talk about this much more later, is that children with autism often had difficulty verbally communicating the presence of their GI symptoms. So they, even if they were verbal in terms of other communication, they had trouble explaining that they were having these symptoms. So we'll come back to this, but that's just a little preview. But the second main thing is that we found that GI symptoms really impacted both the child's well-being and ability to participate and fully engage in activities, as well as the family's overall well-being. So this ranged from issues with attending school, focusing in class, perhaps needing accommodations in school, engaging in extracurricular activities, and then just their overall emotional and well-being. So this parent really kind of hit the nail on the head. They said when their child is not right in the gut, the whole world isn't right. A lot of his behavior and his issues really crop up when he's constipated. He'll get in trouble more, he'll lose privileges, he'll get low point chart numbers from school. It impacts his daily life. So just showing that when these GI issues are happening, like nothing else is kind of going well for this child. As I said, the GI issues also impact the whole family's well-being in terms of the overall temperament, of course, parental distress and frustration with not being able to help your child. Sometimes the family's ability to go out, particularly to restaurants, can cause a lot of unpredictability, and even financial health and stress from having to seek out different treatment options and different intervention. This parent is saying it's painful as a parent to have to try and do something that's uncomfortable or out of the norm to your child because they don't really care for it. And so this was said in the context of having to administer a treatment for the GI symptoms that their child wasn't really tolerating well, but they felt they had to do to help. So getting at this sort of parental distress feeling. And lastly, parents often experience challenges with seeking accessible and quality healthcare for their child's GI problems. Now, certainly this isn't specific to just GI problems. This is a sort of an experience that's unfortunately common to autistic individuals with all sorts of healthcare needs. In this study, we found that parents reported a lengthy or complicated process to even make a healthcare appointment. The medical offices were really not conducive to their child's autism. Parents felt that the providers lacked experience or training in treating their children with complex medical needs, felt they weren't taken seriously. And there are a lot of consequences of these challenges. So some parents I spoke to said, I feel like I shouldn't even be bringing him or her to the doctor anymore because it's like nothing changes. We can't do anything. Sometimes people try to try interventions that they find on the internet because it's, they want to try something. So there are a lot of consequences of this, this poor healthcare quality. And this is just the last quote that I'll show right now. This parent seeing, I think some of the issues that happen are more complex. So providers are sort of expecting a child to come in with a fever. They figure out the cause of that fever, whether or not they require medication, and that's the end of it. But we have a lot of ongoing issues, things that may affect other things, and it's just more complex. So I hope here I have, I've shown you, I think, why these GI symptoms are important to study and to focus on. They're not only common, but they co-occur with a lot of things, and they can cause a lot of distress for not only the child or the adults, but also the surrounding family. So now I'd like to get into pathways that link the gut with autism. In other words, why do we see this connection between GI distress and autism? So the first overall sort of framework to think about is that having autism may actually increase the likelihood of someone having GI symptoms. Now, why might this be? One of the reasons, as I've said, is that co-occurring conditions can really be tied to GI issues. So if we consider a child who has severe sleep issues or a seizure disorder or low muscle tone, those things are sort of a response of having autism, but they in themselves can also influence the GI health. For example, if a child is not sleeping well, they are probably not going to be feeling well physically the next day. In addition, medications that people take for these co-occurring conditions can also have an impact on the gut. So that's just sort of a basic thing to consider, is that sometimes these GI issues in autism could actually be the result of other things going on, like these co-occurring conditions and medications. The other big thing that's going on is the diet. So we know that it's quite common for children and adults with autism to have dietary restrictions or preferences. This often, but not always, is because of sort of sensory differences. So for example, a child avoiding entire food groups or food colors or textures because of a sensory difference. And if you consider a child who is never eating fruits or vegetables, for example, then that's really going to potentially impact their nutritional health and their gut health. And so sometimes I think when we see these GI issues cropping up in autism, it may simply be the result of sort of an inadequate diet, not getting enough fiber, not getting enough water, not getting enough vegetables, that sort of thing. And I don't say simply to imply that it's an easy problem to fix, because I know that it's not, but sometimes it's good to remember just like the basic reasons why someone may not be feeling well in terms of their gut. The other thing to consider is that perhaps there's some directionality in the other way. So perhaps there's something about the gut that is influencing autism. Now, what do I mean by that? The first thing is that if you consider someone, anyone in the general population who is experiencing GI discomfort or pain, but if they're not able to verbalize that to, let's say, a parent or a caregiver successfully, then that pain is going to show up as perhaps irritable behavior or anxiety, sometimes even aggression. And so I think some of the time when we're thinking of behaviors that are common in autism, what we actually might be detecting is behaviors that are just indicative of someone being in distress. So I think this is an important thing to consider, especially as a parent, if you're seeing your child in, who's behaving differently than normal, trying to think about, okay, what might be causing that? Could it be GI discomfort or some other kind of medical issue that could be really causing the child distress? But if they're not able to just approach you and say, hey, mom, hey, dad, my tummy hurts, then this might be their way of communicating that. And the other sort of thing that could be going on is what I've just loosely here called biology. So we know that there are lots of things going on in the gut that can impact brain and behavior. And one of them, of course, is a hot topic, which is the gut microbiome. We know that our the lining of our GI tract is filled with all sorts of microbes, bacteria, viruses, et cetera, that play a really important role in not only our GI health, but in the health of our entire body, including our brain. And so I'll get into a little bit more detail about the gut microbiome in the next slide. But just to say that, other things that this could include are the immune system, hormones, the autonomic nervous system, stress response. There are all sorts of things going on in the gut that have the potential to influence the brain and influence behavior. So I'm going to now get into an overview of this, this gut microbiome research in the context of autism. So a little bit of history is that in the, I would say, like late 90s, there started to be some anecdotal reports of young children who developed regressive autism after repeated exposure to antibiotics for chronic otitis media, ear infections. And it seemed that the eradication of a particular type of bacteria, Clostridialis, through additional antibiotics seemed to actually improve these worsening symptoms. And so this led to some work, including an open label clinical trial in which the researchers enrolled children with regressive ASD. And the children had an 8-week course of vancomycin, which is a broad spectrum antibiotic, followed by 4 weeks of an oral probiotic. And the researchers found that most of the children actually showed behavioral improvements over this period, but then deterioration within 2 weeks of stopping this antibiotic. And so this was sort of additional evidence that perhaps there really is something going on in terms of the bacteria that are in the gut and the behavior of the child, and perhaps even influencing the onset of autism. So some individuals, what the research has shown since then is that some individuals with autism do seem to have distinct clostridial species relative to neurotypical children. And we also know that some of these species are associated with autism and GI symptoms. There's some animal research showing that these species produce neurotoxic metabolites, but it's not really clear from human studies whether those actually affect the brain, the development of the gut, or the function. So all of this to say there is ongoing work trying to piece together what these different species are doing and whether they are influencing not only GI symptoms, but also overall behavior and neurodevelopment. So where we stand today is that there seem to be multiple distinct microbiota populations that have been associated with autism, and this is mostly in the pediatric population. However, the findings are unfortunately really divergent or discordant across the studies. So for example, some studies are finding that a particular bacteria is elevated, whereas another study will find that bacteria to be relatively decreased. And right now as a field, we're trying to rack our brain, trying to figure out, why this is and what we can do with that information. I apologize if you can hear sirens outside. So some of the reasons for those discrepancies are that the studies so far are quite small. And so there's a lot of noise that is being picked up, and there's work underway to try to increase the size of these samples to produce sort of more reliable findings. Different studies have different comparison groups. So sometimes they include unrelated controls. Sometimes they include siblings without autism. Studies are adjusting for different things, different confounders like diet or antibiotics, medications that may be influencing the microbiome. Of course, we know that there is not one single autism. Autism is a complex condition. It's very heterogeneous. So we can't expect to just lump everyone into one group and to see, a particular signal come out. And then, of course, there are variations in the study techniques, where the studies are done, and even like where the stool is sampled from. So we know, for example, that the microbiome of stool is actually a little different from the actual microbiome that is found in the mucus lining of the intestine. So for all of these reasons, we're seeing some discrepancies. And as a field, we're really trying to grapple with, okay, how do we disentangle what's going on? How do we start parsing out what microbes are important, what they do, and how we can leverage that for interventions? I won't spend much time on this, but I just wanted to acknowledge that in addition to the gut potentially influencing the health and behavior of autistic people, there's also some evidence that the role that the gut may be influencing the development of autism. And this comes from animal models primarily, showing that the maternal gut microbiome interacts with the immune system during pregnancy. So these studies are much harder to do in humans, but there is research ongoing. What we're finding is that early life exposures, such as delivery mode, diet, breastfeeding, medications, these things really shape the development of the infant microbiome. And we need to understand how those early life exposures are influencing the microbiome and in turn influencing the neurodevelopment of the child. I've put some references here, which are fully linked at the end of this slide if you'd like to learn more about this, and I'm always happy to chat more. So considering the gut microbiome, and let's say there is some kind of disruption to it that's influencing the health of a person with autism, how do we go about intervening? So we know that diet is one of the biggest influences on the gut microbiome. And these sort of diet or microbial interventions hold promise, but we know that their effects vary across people. So for one person, it may be highly effective, for someone else, not so much. And so again, this is an area of ongoing research. Some of the common therapies for targeting the microbiome are antibiotics, probiotics. Probiotics are the actual live beneficial bacteria. Prebiotics, which are actually the food for the probiotics. So you kind of need both of those things. And then I'm sure some of you have heard of fecal transplants or fecal microbiota transplants. These are when the composition, like the actual stool is replaced in hopes of sort of replenishing the microbiome with a healthier population of microbes from a healthy donor. So I'll talk a little bit more about these fecal transplants because I know a lot of people are interested in them. So in brief, you take stool from a healthy donor. There's some processing that goes on to sort of make it as quote pure as possible, to filter it, blend it, make sure there's as close as possible to just the microbes in that sample. And then there are a few delivery modes. It can be delivered by endoscopy, and there are some pill or even drink formulations that have been developed. So I realize this is a little bit icky, but I think it's important to know since we are starting to see some studies come out that look at these therapies in autism. So these two studies pasted here are from the same research team. They've come out a few years ago at this point. This was the first study, and then this was sort of the follow-up study. And so I'll briefly go into what the study did and what they found. So the purpose was to assess whether a modified fecal microbiota transplant, one, was safe and tolerable in the ASD population, and two, whether it improved GI and autism symptoms. And so this was an open label clinical trial, meaning that the participants knew what they were receiving. There was no blinding, and there was no randomization. So the treatment group was 18 kids with autism that had moderate to severe GI problems. The control group was 20 typically developing children with no GI disorders. The intervention that the children with autism received were this 14-day course of vancomycin, which is an antibiotic, Movi Prep, which is essentially flushes out the bowel, the microbiota. So this is essentially the transplant part, and then Prilosec, which is an acid inhibitor. And this ensures that the microbes can actually get through the acidic stomach lining without get through and make it to the intestine. And then throughout the study, the parents collected stool samples, assessed GI symptoms, autism symptoms, and other global impressions in their kids. And so the researchers did find, that at the beginning of the study, at baseline, the kids with autism had a less diverse gut bacteria. So this means they didn't have as many different types of bacteria as the control kids. But at the end of the treatment, that diversity was actually similar. So there was an increase in diversity, which is what we want, because actually a diverse microbiome is more resilient. And the authors found that there were specific types of microbes that actually changed with the treatment. So it wasn't only a change in diversity, but it was a change in some of these specific bacteria as well. In terms of the autism and GI symptoms, the investigators reported overall an improvement in GI symptoms in terms of abdominal pain, indigestion, constipation, diarrhea, etc. Seemed to report an improvement in social responsiveness and autism severity, an increase in developmental age, and there was a significant negative correlation between the change in GI and autism scores, meaning that the more the more that the GI symptoms improved, the lower or less severe the autism scores were. And overall, they found that the treatment was generally well tolerated. There were some temporary adverse effects, but those were pretty minimal. So I think it's important to talk about the limitations and caveats of this research, because it's gotten a lot of attention, understandably, but we want to make sure that we're not sort of taking this finding and running away with it and extrapolating too much from it. So what I sort of want to make sure I emphasize is that this study, first of all, was not placebo-controlled or blinded or randomized. So again, that means that the participants knew that they were receiving this treatment. There was no group that was receiving a placebo to kind of measure it against. There was no randomization of participants. And that's not uncommon for this sort of early phase study. And my understanding is there is work going on to try to replicate this in a larger study in a more rigorous way. But, so just to take these findings with a great grain of salt. The other thing is that there were a lot of different parts to the treatment, right? There was the antibiotic, there was this bowel cleanse, there was the fecal microbiota transplant itself, and there was the acid inhibitor. So if we see a benefit, it's not totally clear whether it's the combination of all four of these things, or maybe a couple of them, or maybe just one of them that was particularly helpful. The other thing, which I've alluded to, but I'll talk more in just a few moments, is that assessing GI symptoms in this population is challenging. And so just because a parent is saying, oh, I think these symptoms are getting better, or I think they're getting worse, that may not always be true if they're not able to perfectly assess what their child is feeling. And the other thing speaks to sort of the heterogeneity of autism. Again, there's no such thing as just one autism. So even if this treatment seemed to be successful in this population, it doesn't mean it'll be successful in all kids with autism. The other thing to consider is, let's say these findings are truly real, and we do see this improvement in autism symptoms and GI symptoms following this microbiota transplant. There's a question of whether these improvements are due to the microbes themselves influencing the brain, or is it that the microbes are helping relieve GI symptoms, and that's just making the child feel better, right? And I think that's a pretty intuitive thing for all of us to understand, that if we're not feeling, if our belly is bothering us, we're not going to be feeling well. That's going to influence our mood and our behavior. I think this study was important, and I'm glad that people are looking at this, but I always just want to kind of give some of these caveats when I'm describing it. So in this next portion, I'm going to be talking about how do I actually identify and manage GI symptoms in autism. So just a couple of reminders before I get into this. Of course, as I've said multiple times now, autism is heterogeneous. So that means there's no single cause of autism. There may be a subset of autism in which the gut is implicated, but that may not be in everyone. And there is probably no one single cause of GI symptoms or gut dysfunction in autism. That means it's probably caused by a number of different things, and that combination of things will differ across people. So this has implications in terms of etiology and treatment or prevention, because we're not looking for a single sort of smoking gun here, but we're looking for the various different things that could be influencing the gut and what things might be most relevant for each person with autism. And then just a final disclaimer that I'm not a medical doctor. And so while I may summarize sort of the evidence-based literature here, it's important that you do talk to your medical provider before trying anything that you may hear about in this talk or in other talks. So in terms of identifying GI symptoms, I mentioned this qualitative study that I ran, looking at the experiences of children with autism and GI symptoms, as well as their families. And I noted this first theme. I said I'd come back to this on children with autism often have difficulty verbally communicating the presence of their GI symptoms. So a little bit more about this. So first of all is that the parents of children with ASD that had fluent speech, so I'm talking about children who are totally capable of talking, who are verbal, who don't seem to have any apparent language difficulties. Even those children often had difficulties communicating when they were experiencing GI symptoms. So this seems to be a challenge sort of regardless of the child's verbal ability. The second thing is that parents reported relying on bodily signs to identify when their child was experiencing GI symptoms. And I'll describe this a little bit more in depth in a moment. But bodily signs are things like gas or diarrhea, things that you can actually observe with your own two eyes or ears or nose. And then the other thing is parents reported relying on nonverbal behaviors to identify when their child was experiencing GI symptoms. So again, I'll say a little bit more about this, but nonverbal behaviors are things like maybe sleep issues or irritability or aggression, things that don't really at first seem like they could be related to the gut, but might be, and they're not verbal, they're just behaviors. So let me talk a little bit more about each of these things. This is just a quote here about this finding that even in verbal kids, they may have difficulty communicating when they're experiencing these GI symptoms. This quote has to do with the use of these bodily signs to detect GI symptoms. So this parent is saying, something as simple as putting my hand on his stomach, I could feel everything moving and growling. He had severe gas. You could see it in his movements. Sometimes I'd have to bring him to the doctor. They would basically have to assist because the stool becomes so dried out that it would no longer be moving through his system. So in this case, this parent is using these bodily signs as an indicator that something is going awry in terms of her child's GI health. And then this nonverbal behavior, there are a couple examples here. this parent is saying he gets angry, short, kind of semi-belligerent with really basic questions, very atypical for him, and then found out that he just had to go to the bathroom. That's kind of how he presents. But then if you ask him, do you need to go to the bathroom? He'll say, no, I'm fine. So again, a child who isn't verbally stating that, they're in GI pain or need to go to the bathroom, but that's coming out in their behavior. They're sort of semi-belligerent, a little angry, perhaps irritable, and that improves after they use the bathroom. And then this second quote is saying, when the stomach hurts, there's almost an immediate physical reaction. She could scream, throw things. After she calms down, she tells us, my tummy hurts. Every time the police had to come out because she was being really destructive, the first thing she would say as she regained her composure was, my tummy hurts. So this is unfortunately a very difficult, but I think salient example of sort of how extreme these sort of communication behaviors can be. So in this case, this was actually an adult who wasn't able to verbally explain that she was having belly pain, but it would come out in her behavior. So these are just, I show these quotes to illustrate sort of the variety of ways in which this GI distress can manifest. And I know most of the audience members today are parents. This is something to keep in mind is, if your child isn't able to just walk up to you and say, my belly hurts, or if they're not just, clutching their stomach, these are some of the things that you may have to use to start kind of playing a detective and figuring out what might be going on. So a final point that I'll make about this measurement problem is that, the assessment or the measurement of GI symptoms in autism is quite challenging. And the tools that are used in the neurotypical pediatric population may not be appropriate for the autism population. So there are limitations of the existing tools that are out there. As I said, some of them aren't specific to autism. The ones that are specific to autism, there haven't been a lot of psychometric studies really showing how well they perform and what they're doing. Some of them are missing items that we know are important in terms of the GI system, like mealtime or diet or behavior. And I really feel like this hinders both research and clinical care. So I've just screenshotted a couple studies here to highlight the efforts that are going on to develop and validate these parent report GI screeners for the autism population. And I know this isn't entirely satisfactory because everyone wants a tool right now, and I totally get that. But I'll just say, this work is going on and people are trying to improve on this. So as a parent, what are some things to look for if you suspect your child may be having GI distress, but they're not communicating it? So first is the most obvious thing is that they are communicating it verbally. There's a direct verbalization such as ouch, hurts, it bad, tummy, belly, or delayed echolalia that, something like, does your tummy hurt? Does your tummy hurt? Does your tummy hurt? That could be sort of the most intuitive sign. These bodily signs that I mentioned, so constipation or lack of bowel movements, diarrhea, a grumbling or rumbling belly, visibly seeing the abdomen swelling. Those are all bodily signs to look for. In terms of nonverbal behaviors, pointing to the abdomen or being sensitive to that area, grimacing or wincing, like chewing on clothes or constantly clearing the throat, constantly eating or drinking or swallowing, that could be a clue. Applying pressure to abdomen by, for example, leaning on furniture, unusual posturing, or in general, like groaning, irritability, being maybe a little bit aggressive, or sleep disturbances. I know I recognize this is sort of a long and non-specific list, but these are the ways that we know that these GI symptoms may show up in different kids. So then in terms of actually managing these symptoms, I'll go through a few slides with just kind of some advice on this. So the first thing is to take note of the behaviors that your child uses when they're trying to communicate symptoms. So if you know that for them, they become irritable or they're not sleeping, if you see that pattern come up again, then that may be a hint that perhaps it's their belly. Keeping a log of what they eat, their symptoms, and their toileting patterns can be really helpful to identify potential links between these things. And then remember the whole person. So we all benefit from being able to move our bodies, eating, staying hydrated, sleeping well. And so sometimes it's the most obvious things, like you're not having enough water and so you're constipated. So sometimes it's good to just look back at these basics and make sure we're checking off all those boxes. And then of course, this is unfortunately a bit of a trial and error process. And so what I hear from parents is it can take time to start to identify what these communication strategies are and what the triggers are. Sometimes things change over time, which is frustrating. I wish I could give you like a handbook on exactly what to do for your child, but it's going to differ across different children. And so there is some of that trial and error. In terms of dietary strategies, so something to keep in mind is I think we hear a lot about certain foods that may be, offending foods that may exacerbate GI symptoms. Those are, of course, really important to recognize. But sometimes in an effort to remove those foods, the diets actually become too restrictive. And that can actually cause GI symptoms. So for example, if you're eliminating all vegetables because, a couple vegetables seem to bother your child, then that may actually exacerbate the situation. So my suggestion is to monitor carefully, don't remove too much at once, and if you're not seeing an improvement after removing a food, then add it back in. Getting the right amount of fiber is really important. And so, if this can't completely be done with diet, something to consider is using a fiber supplement. A lot of these can be mixed into a drink. Start very slowly. Of course, work on adequate hydration. And with all of these things, work with a medical provider to make sure that someone's monitoring your child. Building a team can be helpful. So GI symptoms may seem like they are, something that just a gastroenterologist should focus on, but really this can take these sort of issues can benefit from a multidisciplinary approach. So primary care physicians or nurse practitioners, of course, gastroenterologists, psychiatrists, especially if your child is taking medications that could be impacting GI symptoms. That's important to keep in mind. Working with a nutritionist, a behavioral therapist, to figure out ways to improve the diet or to get around sensory issues, anxiety issues that may be affecting the gut, and then discussing potential accommodations with your child's school, or if it's an adult, their employer. As I've mentioned, there are some challenges to seeking GI care, and so I won't go into depth on all of these, but you do have the slides if you want to look back on it. Something I do want to draw your attention to is this idea of diagnostic overshadowing. So this is a phenomenon that occurs when symptoms of a physical illness are attributed to someone's neuropsychiatric or neurodevelopmental disorder. So in this case, a child with autism that has GI symptoms, if you go to a provider and the provider says, oh, that's just their autism, that would be diagnostic overshadowing because it's attributing the GI symptoms to this other neurodevelopmental disorder. So as you can imagine, that increases the risk of treatment delay, development of complications, and some of it is due to stigmatization and negative attitudes, but a lot of it is also just the lack of education or training or confidence among clinicians in terms of treating the autism population. So that's something to keep in mind. And this is just an example of that. This parent from that study is saying a lot of physicians seem uninterested, sort of like your child has autism, this goes with it. I apologize, I skipped ahead. So if you are in a position to advocate for your child or the autistic person in your life, keep this in mind, is that unfortunately, this is something you may see, and it's important to kind of push back and encourage that your loved one or caregiving experiences the same level of care as a neurotypical person would. And here I've put some sort of hints on working with medical providers. So I recognize sometimes there may be a lot of different issues going on, sometimes doing a problem-focused visit where you just say, okay, today we're going in to talk about reflux, or today we're going in to talk about headaches. That does require more appointments, but it does also increase the likelihood that you'll address each issue at each appointment. bringing any information you can, such as videos, behavioral, diet, symptom, toileting logs. If you're not happy with the care that you're getting with a primary care physician, for example, discussing a referral to a specialist can be important. As I said, really advocating for the person, being mindful of this diagnostic overshadowing. Keep in mind the autism context in terms of all of the things about autism that may be coming into play, but also consider that sometimes GI symptoms are a distinct medical issue and need to be treated as such. And something you can also do if you think this would be helpful is to talk to the medical office or the provider in advance about how to make the visit more comfortable for your child. So whether that's, as soon as you get to the office, can they go directly to an examination room so they don't have to wait in this loud, bright waiting room. Whatever the case may be, having that phone call or conversation in advance can be helpful. And then I've linked to two papers here, which I think are just some of the best papers that have been written on this subject. But they're by Dr. Tim Bowie and colleagues. Dr. Tim Bowie is a gastroenterologist who specializes in individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions. And so I'd actually recommend printing out these papers and bringing them with you to the medical visit, or at least reviewing them ahead of time and kind of, I think these can help you be a little bit more prepared for that visit. If your physician is amenable to it, perhaps send them these in advance and see if they'd be willing to review them. And then just a last reminder to sort of remain skeptical. So this gut-brain field is growing rapidly. There's a lot of exciting and promising research coming out, but we have to remember that all of these therapies and interventions have both potential benefits and risks. So it's important to remain skeptical, to really consult a trusted medical provider before trying anything, because there is unfortunately a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of chatter about what things might be helpful, but these things, sometimes do have real health risks as well. So that brings me to the end of the talk. I just want to acknowledge various funders of this work: the Wendy Clagg Center at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, the Psych Epi Training Program at Johns Hopkins, my former PhD advisor, Dr. Danny Fallon, and Dr. Tim Bowie, who is that pediatric gastroenterologist that I mentioned that works at Boston Children's Hospital. Of course, I'd like to thank Spark for inviting me, and I'd like to thank CARD at Kennedy Krieger Institute. Here is my contact information. Please feel free to email me. I do post a fair bit about this topic on Twitter, so if you like Twitter, feel free to follow me there for more information. And then I will get into the Q&A, and I just wanted to allude to the fact that, or reference the fact that there are some slides at the end of this presentation, which include all of the references that I've mentioned, as well as some specific tools. So if you're, asking how to increase food variety or meet nutritional needs, how to reduce constipation, other GI resources for autism, I've linked a bunch of stuff here because I know it's impossible to cover everything in just this 1 hour. So hopefully those things are helpful as well. So I'm gonna pause there, and I think ready for some questions, and thank you for your attention.
Amazing. Thank you so much. There's quite the chatter going on in the chat box and in the Q&A. So we have a lot of questions. So I'm just going to jump in. Some of them are a little bit more specific. Is there anything in particular we should look for in terms of probiotics, Activia, like capsules? Like, what is the better way to natural? Like, what is the better way to go for that?
That's a great question. And that reminds me that I actually have some guidelines that I can send out after the webinar, just to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. But in brief, it's going to depend on exactly the issue that you're trying to target. So there's no single probiotic that's going to do everything. I would recommend thinking about, okay, what are you trying to target, and seeing if there's been research looking at that particular probiotic. In general, it's good to have a probiotic that lists the exact bacteria and the amounts that the bacteria are in. If you're picking up a probiotic at the store and it doesn't have that information, don't even bother buying it. It's not a good product. And I'm sure I'm forgetting plenty of things. Yeah, making sure that information is on there. Seeing if there's any research out there on a particular one. I know that a popular one, it used to be called VSL3, and now it's called something else. I know that one arguably has the most research out there showing promise in helping GI symptoms, so I'll send out that information as well. But there's no one probiotic out there that we know is like a magic bullet.
Okay.
So it is probably going to depend on the person, but I'll send that information out.
Fabulous. Thank you for that. I think in passing, you mentioned a benefiber or a citrusel or one of those kinds of things that we can put into drinks.
Yeah.
Should that be in conjunction with the probiotic or separate from the probiotic? Are we combining?
Yeah. It's a good question. So ideally what we want is a combination of probiotics and prebiotics, right? Because the probiotics need the prebiotics to, thrive and multiply and all that. That being said, it can be good to just try things slowly, try one thing at a time, and make sure that, your child is adjusting to it well before adding something else. And that's true for all of us. We don't want to throw in too many variables at once. So I would say start with something like the benefiber or the citrusel in slow amounts. Of course, this is all working with your medical provider, making sure they're okay with it and they're monitoring it. And then eventually starting to maybe add in a probiotic and seeing whether that combination helps.
Okay, fab. If there is a suspicion of specific bacteria missing or less common in an individual, how can that be checked?
That's a great question. Right now, there are a lot of sort of commercial products out there that kind of promise to give you your microbial profile and to say what things are high versus low. The reality of it is it's not really yet in a space where that information can be used to make healthcare decisions. So, for example, I'm sure many people are familiar with the genetic testing, the genetic company 23andMe. There are those equivalents sort of in the microbiome space. So for example, American Gut Project is a really cool company affiliated with University of California, San Diego, where you can provide a sample and they give you back a report, and then your data goes into a big repository. That's not just autism, it's anyone really can donate. And so you do see relative to like some other people, your age and your sex, how you match up, but it's nowhere near saying, you have too little of this, you need to rectify that. So we're not yet at that space. I think the most useful way to use that information, and I've done this for myself personally, is to look at that report and sort of see, okay, what are the different types of microbes out there? How do they compare to someone? And does it look like I'm missing many different types or kind of diversity of microbes? And what we know from the research is sort of the best indicator of diversity of microbes is actually how many plants people eat, how many different types of plants. So like a surefire way to start to improve that would actually be to be eating more plant-based foods, different types of plant-based foods. Of course, I recognize that's not always possible because of dietary or sensory sensitivities. And so that's where something like the prebiotics and the probiotics come in. But I apologize, this is a bit of a long-winded answer. All of this to say, we can't yet point to specific microbes that are elevated or depleted and try to rectify those. But the best way to improve the GI health in general is to eat more plants.
Okay, great. I just want to remind folks, I know there's a ton of questions, that Calliope is not a clinician, so make sure you go to a provider if you have specific questions about your own situation or your child's situation. So we've been talking a lot about kids with disabilities. How does this change, if at all, for the adult population?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, a lot of the research that's been done, honestly, in autism, including on this gut connection, has been done in children. So we don't know as much in adults. That's something that's starting to change, but that is the reality. I would say everything I've said so far in terms of approaches to diet and monitoring symptoms and behavior and things like that, I think all of those things apply to the adult population, with the big caveat that, of course, adults, can be more independent. And so, if you're an autistic adult and you're sitting in this training, these are things to consider. I don't want to infantilize anyone by suggesting that, not everyone is able to communicate or recognize when they're having GI distress. So sort of the approaches to identifying that may be different depending on age, but I think the approaches to managing those symptoms would be pretty similar at this point.
So we're getting a lot of questions around reflux. So what can you tell us about reflux and how is that related to all of the GI? Does it have a role to play?
Reflux is another one of those, another one of the symptoms that are actually quite common. And sometimes this is merely a symptom that can come and go. And sometimes it's actual GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease or disorder, I think it's called. This can be one that's unfortunately really hard to detect in anyone, actually, not even just a person with autism, because it doesn't always feel like GI symptoms. It can feel like heartburn. It can feel like chest pain. So in one of those papers that I linked to by Tim Bowie, one of the ones that I suggested reading or bringing to your medical provider, it actually shows for reflux specifically some of the behaviors or signs that you might look out for. And so if you see your child doing those things in particular, that might be a signal that there's a reflux issue going on. Reflux is a little, I think, it's sort of a process of identifying potential dietary triggers, like tomatoes tend to contribute to reflux. But again, if it's a severe case, bringing your child to the doctor and talking to them about medication options might be necessary.
Speaking of the Bowie articles, are they easy to find or are they abstracts? Some stuff is behind firewall.
Yes, good question. I will be sure to send the full PDFs with those.
Excellent. Okay, yeah. That would be great.
Yeah.
I also just want to mention, so we have one question and they want to know, are you still needing subjects for your study?
That's a great question. So yes and no. Currently we're kind of on a pause because of COVID. But that being said, we certainly will be starting recruitment again soon. And I do have sort of other studies in the pipeline. My suggestion is, if you're interested in talking more with me, finding out about potential research opportunities, there are two things. Feel free to email me and we can get in touch and I can try to connect you with anyone who's doing that sort of research or keep you in mind. And the second thing is that, of course, Spark is an amazing resource in terms of contributing to research. I myself am planning to put in some proposals to recruit participants through Spark for this very type of work. So honestly, the best advice I would give is to get connected with Spark. And I'm sure someone, Beverly or Jessica, can put in the chat like the link to do that. Because if I am going to Spark and saying, okay, I want to recruit kids with autism between these ages that have a history of these GI symptoms, please send me a list of the people to contact. like that would be the most efficient way for me to do it. And that ensures that you can get connected with any studies that you may be interested in. And of course, providing your information doesn't mandate that you do that research. It just means that you would get invited to do it. And then you can decide whether you want to participate in any particular study.